Hello and welcome back to part 3, the second part of the coloring process. So we'll begin by stamping all the additional images for the other characters in the set, including Tweedledee, the Caterpillar, and the Mad Hatter. And I will have to stamp Tweedledum separately. Actually, it is the same set. For Tweedledee and Dum, it's the same stamp, I mean. The only thing you do change when you're stamping the second character, depending on how you want the eyes to be oriented, is to use one of the other stamps in the set. So what you have to do basically is mask off the face, because the way that that stamp is, it has the character looking in one direction. So if you want to have the character looking in a different direction, you pretty much just have to mask off the face and then stamp the individual stamp for the different face, so to speak. So I did try doing this at first by wiping off the ink and then stamping, but that was a little difficult to do. It didn't turn out so well because I wasn't successful in completely covering up the face. So I decided doing a simple mask would be the best thing to do. So I took a piece of the previously used masking removable post-it labeling tape, if that made sense, and just cut it small enough to fit inside the face before adding the ink, then removing that mask from the face. And when I stamp it, as long as I don't have to stamp it a second time, then all I should need to do at this point is find the face with the eyes, nose, and mouth going in the opposite direction. So I just place that down in the MISTI again and pick that up. And I'll just stamp the face down, and then we'll be ready to move on to the coloring. So now I have all the remaining characters ready to go, and as you can see I have Tweedledee and Tweedledum with their faces looking in opposite directions. So I'll begin like I did with the last set of characters by using the same copy paper to temporarily cover up the images that I'm not working on. And for the jacket, I'll be working with R14, not the jacket, but the pants and the hat and some other parts. I'm working with R14 and V06. And what I do first is I lay down R14 all over the pants for that first layer of color. And what you're going to see right after I finish this is when I start overlaying the pant color with V06 right on top of this R14, it gives a maroon colored pant. And if you hear a little dog barking in the background every now and again, it's my little Maltese Polo, and he seems to be hearing something going on interesting outside. I think my neighbor has been in the middle of building a shed, so he seems to hear it and bark at that all day long. But in any case, hopefully he won't be too noisy during the filming process. So now moving on to the bow, which I will be also coloring the same way that I just did the pants. So I'm starting with R14 on as the base color on the bow, and then going over that with V06. I am not coloring over the little skull that is in the middle of his bow. I'm just going to leave it exactly as it is. And it's already white, so nothing that I really need to do with that. And the other part that will be colored with this same color scheme is the band of the two bands of the hat. So just doing the exact same process as I did with the bow tie and the pants. And now I'm getting ready to color in the jacket and the hat, and I'm moving on to the purple colors, which are V04, V06, and V09 for the darkest of shadows. I start off by putting down a base of V04 on the entire jacket, including the collar. There are some buttons on the left-hand side of the jacket. They're really kind of tiny, but I did do my best to avoid coloring right over those. On the right-hand side, there aren't any buttons, which makes sense because you'd only have that if it were a double-breasted jacket. But anyway, I digress. I'm then going to use V06 to add in the beginnings of some shadows. So I add that near the hand where it looks like the inside of the cuff, where the arm is tucked basically behind the jacket, where the arm cuff meets the sleeve of the jacket. I add some shadows there as well as some on the outside edges of the jacket. I'll repeat the process when I do move over to the other side of the jacket. And V09 is where I will add in the darkest of shadows, then pick up the V06 marker and blend that out. And since this process is pretty repetitive, I'm going to speed through the remaining coloring on the right-hand side, just laying down V04 first, adding some of the shadows with V06, then going back over with that to blend it, and then finally adding the deepest shadows with V09 and then blending that out. So I'm making the jacket that's poking out between the legs the darkest area, as well as the side, basically the right hand side where the hand is kind of looking like it's on the hip. So now I'm moving on to coloring the hat, and at first I start with V04 again. I drew a line on the inside of the stamped image and then started from that point and flicking towards the center of the hat. And I'm doing the same thing along the sides of that little label that says 10-6. And then I'll move on to V06 and add some darker flicking motions on going inwards. So this is pretty much the same type of process you use with hair as well. Just blending that in towards the center and leaving the center pretty much white, but when I do go back and blend back over this with the V04 marker, I'm bringing that color in, starting from the darkest edge on the outside and bringing it in closer to the middle. I won't completely cover over the middle because I want that highlight to show on the hat because it helps show that it's not a flat object. And because there is a thin strip in between the two, I guess I'll call them maroon bands on the hat, I added in some V06 marker in between those two bands. So now moving on to the hat brim. Again, I start with V04 and go around the entire brim. Then I'll add more shadows to it using V04 at first, and then a teeny tiny bit of V09. So as you can see, I'm just kind of drawing or marking in that section where it looks like the hat brim is going behind to the back of the head. And then I'm blending that out again with the V04 marker. So actually I made a mistake in what I said. I did not use the V09 marker on the hat at that point. So now I'm moving on to the vest, which is a lime green color. There is a Copic equivalent for this Spectrum Noir marker that I'm using, the LG4. I did put the equivalent marker in Copic in the student material handout, so if you prefer to or have that marker, you could use that instead of what I use today. So sometimes I do just take advantage of what I do have on hand, and the majority of what I'm using in this project is Copic markers, but there were a couple of little exceptions, and that happened to be one of them. For the hair, because I want as much variation as possible in the color, and it is red, I'm using 4 different colors of red for the hair. So I'm starting off with R14. Now I'm adding some R24. And in just a moment, I will zoom in much closer that you can see more detail on the hair. So now at this point, I'm moving on to the third marker. I believe this is the R46, if I remember correctly, but you can refer to the student instructions in case I have that incorrect. And I'm going to freeze frame for just a moment, and you'll be able to see some of the contrasts that I've already built in using these three colors, in case you couldn't see it very well with my hand being in the way. So as I move to the bottom portion of the hair, the part that's at the very bottom and looks like it would be going towards the back of the head, I start progressively coloring that part of it darker, but I don't make it completely dark, and I will add in some of the R14 as well as some of the R24 and get that somewhat blended together. And so when my hand moves away, you'll be able to see again, at least briefly. And now I'm adding R89 to add some really dark parts to the hair. And I'll pause it for a moment whenever my hand moves out of the way so that you can see that contrast. So I'm still adding some R89 up right underneath where that hat brim starts, because it would be the very, very darkest right underneath that edge. So hopefully you can see some of that contrast that I built in. I'm going back over that with the R24 to blend it out some more, so it's gradually getting lighter as the hair gets further away from the hat brim. So there's a look at what that looks like right now. And now I'm going to start on coloring the face, and like I've done on all the other characters that have a natural skin tone color, I'm using E00 as the base color, then going over in different spots with E11 in order to add some shadows. And mainly I concentrate that like just above the eyes where the eyelids would be, right underneath the hairline, where some shadows might be there from the hair. And then, of course, on the neck, which is going to be further in the shadows. And now I'm adding the pupil color, which is Y15. And I'm darkening up the pupil because it, for some reason, looked very, very light. So I corrected that first and then came back with a gel pen to add the white highlights like I've done to all the other characters. And now I'm coloring in these shoes with these two different gray markers, C3 and N5. So I'm leaving the top of the shoe in the lighter color and then using the darker color for the basically the sole of the shoe. So I'm not doing anything terribly complicated at all. And I realized at this point that I needed to go back and color in the skin on the hands. So I'm taking care of that now, starting with E00. And then I'll pick up the E11 marker and add some contrast to the hands as well. And with that part of it almost finished, there are only a few little details to take care of. I'm going to color in that coffee cup. I'm using two blue-green markers. One of them is BG13, which is a pretty bright aqua color. And then the BG72 is a much more muted blue-green color for the little detail on the coffee mug on the side. And then finally, of course, there's a little bit of steam coming off of the cup, so I'm using some C3 to just kind of color in a little bit of that steam in order to make it look, I guess, more like smoke is what I was after here. And I went back with the V09 marker just to add a couple additional details, and I'm finished with that image. So now we move on to the caterpillar. And I'll have to admit, this is not the prettiest creature I've ever seen, so it is not my favorite character, but of course I could not ignore ignore the caterpillar. He had to be done. But even if I don't like the caterpillar, I do love the mushroom or toadstool or whatever you want to call it, because it's pretty cool. And I could see using that mushroom with other characters for other projects. So I really do like that part of it as far as this image is concerned. Now I'm using a couple of pinky peach colored markers, which you see on the screen. It's the R20 and R32. So the R20 is my base color, and I'm not worrying about the glasses that are there. I'm pretty much just coloring over the entire face and then using the R32 marker to add some definition and shadows. And for all the little legs, I'm also going to be using those same two colors on all of those as well. So just doing some quick coloring with the R20 marker and then going back over and adding some additional definition and shading around the edge or the outside edge of each one of the legs. So this has actually been one of the easier characters to color all along. So I guess I could be happy for that, since it's not my favorite one. At least it's not that difficult to color, as it's mainly a lot of blue, a lot of this peachy pink, and a tad of yellow. So now that I'm finishing up all the legs and skin, I'm moving on to the body, and I'm using 3 different blue markers. B00 is the base color that I'm using, and I'm going to cover the majority of the body with this color, but not completely. So mainly I'm focusing more on the center of the body, because that is going to be the lighter part of the image. Then I'm moving on to my B23 marker and starting from the outside edge and just kind of moving inwards with the color and making sure to avoid those little dots on the image, because those need to be yellow. So just being careful to avoid that. I'm drawing over the existing lines from the stamp, and I will be blending out over what I'm drawing shortly. Before I blend it out, I'm adding a little more color at each side, and just using a flicking motion to bring it inwards towards the center of the body. And as I finish this up, the last marker that I will be using as far as the blues are concerned is the B29. And I'm going to be adding that only at the very edges and bringing it in just a little bit from the side. And then I'll also do the same thing on the very outside edge as well. And then, as you can see, I picked up the B23 marker again, and I am blending out the B29 marker while it is still fairly wet. And so now moving to the other side, starting with B29 and adding in the deepest, darkest color around the lines on the edge right there before the arms, as you can see, and on the outside edges of the caterpillar's body before blending over again with B23. So I just kind of keep switching back and forth between those two markers as I'm blending out the color until I'm satisfied with the overall effect. And then the dots are being colored with, let's see, Y15. Not doing any shading of that whatsoever. And the hookah I'm keeping really simple. I'm just using the Y28 marker, which is the same kind of gold tone marker that I used when I was coloring the white rabbit and coloring the watch bezel. So now finished with the caterpillar and beginning to work on the mushroom. So the mushroom takes a little bit of time to color, and that's because you have to work on avoiding all those little, I don't know what you call them. I guess I'll just call them little dots for now. I don't want to color those in red, so what I'm doing is I'm drawing basically drawing around the outside edge of each one because it makes it easier for me to color in between and not accidentally get some red onto places where I do not want that. So it does take a little bit of time to do this step, but it is worth doing to avoid coloring where you don't want it. And once you do have it, it makes actually the coloring process actually quite a bit faster. As you can see now, I'm kind of speeding right along and getting it filled in. And since I'm going to be doing the same process across the entire top, I will speed up the rest of it until I move on to the next marker color and describe what I'm doing. And as I said, here is now the speed coloring of the base color of R24 across the entire mushroom cap. And now that that's concluded, I'll be moving on to R29. And the first thing I'm doing is going around the underside of each one of those, I guess, dots as I call them, since I can't think of what they are, as well as the edge of the mushroom cap just before it goes, I guess, to the side, which we call the underside of that mushroom cap, because there's not going to be red on the underside of it. It's just coming right down to that edge where it would get the darkest before it changes over to the basically the brown colors that you can see over on the left hand side on a prior one that I'd colored. So as I said, just adding some of that contrast around the edge with the R29 marker. I'm blending it back out with the R24, as you can see right here. And I will be adding a little bit of the R89 to make some parts of it even darker and make more contrast between the edge of that mushroom cap as compared to its stem. So just taking some extra time to blend those colors together, and now it looks even more dimensional than it would have if I hadn't done those particular things. So just adding a few additional touches, and now I'm finished with the mushroom cap. And there is a teeny tiny mushroom, as you can see, off to the right hand side. So I'm just coloring that in with R24. I will add a little bit of contrast with the R29 marker, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that little teeny tiny mushroom cap that's underneath the big one. So now that that is finished, I'm going to start working on the stem and the underside of the mushroom cap, starting off with a layer of E50 just as a base color. And by the time I get finished coloring this, you're really not going to see much of that left by the time I'm done, because there's going to be quite a bit of shading. As you'll see, I'm using 3 other markers in the E family to color that in. Starting with E13 right now and starting to add some contrast by using flicking motions down from where the base and the mushroom cap separate, so to speak. And then you see there's an additional section of the mushroom cap where it's in the middle. And sorry, I can't figure out how to describe this, but there's a section of that stem that looks like it's in 2 pieces, I guess, for lack of a different way to describe it. So I'm going to be building in a lot of contrast right underneath the mushroom cap, as well as for that bottom piece. So if you kind of look over to the left, you can kind of see where I'm headed with that and what the overall look is going to be. Something to keep in mind is that the example on the left has had some time to dry, and what I'm working on currently is wet marker, so it is going to look a bit darker at first because the colors are still wet. And over time, they probably will fade a little bit. And also, there is some truth to the fact that even when you're using the same colors and methods, coloring an image the second time or even third time, it's never going to look exactly the same from one time to the next. And that's just kind of the nature of coloring, is each time you do it, it is going to be a little bit different from the time before. Sometimes that could mean it looks better than the time before. Sometimes maybe it isn't that way. In any case, I'm moving on to coloring some of the additional items on this image, so I'm just keeping that part simple, using YG63 for the plants or leaves that I'm seeing underneath. And there are a few stones there, so I'm using some N5 to color in that stone. And then using, let's see, N3 to add a little bit of shade variation. Now it's time to move on to Tweedledee and Tweedledum, but I will only be showing you the coloring of one of these characters because it is exactly the same for both of them. The only difference between the two is the hat color is different, but other than that, exactly the same process on both. So I'm starting off with an R46 marker for the red stripes on the shirt, and I will also be using that color on the cap and the socks for each character. As you're probably wondering, why the heck is the example on the left-hand side so light compared to what I'm actually coloring? And pretty soon you're going to see what the reason is, and it's all about using a colorless blender. There are probably some well-known uses for a blender versus some not so well-known uses. Maybe you know about this one, maybe you don't, but one of the awesome things you can do with a colorless blender is actually force some of the color that you've already put down to go through the paper. One of the reasons to use a good quality paper when you're doing Copic coloring, and especially if using a colorless blender, is to avoid color bleeding out where you don't intend it to. It did still do that just a bit anyway, but it is sure less on Express It Copic blending card and even Nina Solar White when you're using the colorless blender the way that I am. And my whole purpose here is to fade out that color because it makes it look lighter overall, even though it doesn't look, like I said, necessarily as light as the finish card example on the left. It will eventually look like that after all the ink and colorless blender has dried. So now I'm moving on to the face and coloring in the skin, and it's the same two markers I've been using for every character so far, so that part I've kept constant from character to character, unless we're talking about an animal that wouldn't have the same skin tone. So I'm just coloring in with E00, then using E11 to add some contrast and shadows. So I'm just laying down the E11 around the contours of the face, like the mouth, the nose, or suggestion of nose, I guess, because it's just a little line there. I add some contrast above and below the eye to make them not look so flat. Then I'll go over to the arms and color in the arms and hands with E00 and pick up the E11 and go around the edges on both sides of the arms to add, what was I trying to say? To make the arms look more rounded. So you can see what a big difference that makes when you do just one additional marker. Makes a huge difference. So now moving on to the pants on the character, and I've been using pretty much the same blue markers throughout this entire series, which is, in this case, I'm using B12 and B14 for these pants. I'm primarily going to be using B12 to color the majority of the pants, but I'm not just solidly coloring it in. I'm starting from the outer edges and flicking the color inwards, so I'll just be gradually moving that color in towards the center while leaving a bit of white showing through. I want it to be darkest right there at the edges where the pockets are, and then just gradually get lighter as you come around the front. This is also emphasizing the fact that Tweedledee and Tweedledum are quite round little characters, so that is the reason why I'm coloring in this manner, is in order to keep in line with how the characters look. I'm going to be 14 and adding some more contrast. I'll just kind of go back and forth from each side, and then I'm adding in some additional areas to suggest where additional, I guess, wrinkles in the clothing would be. And I'll keep blending this out by switching between B12 and B14 as I add more and more color. I keep doing this while the colors are wet so that they keep blending together. So same process, except I'm just kind of moving inward slowly, adding more color, and doing the same thing to the pant legs. Now I'm going to move on to the suspenders, and I'm putting down B12 first, and then putting B14 on just the outside edge of the suspenders. And after doing that, I'm going to use the colorless blender marker again, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the stripes on the shirt. I'm just scribbling over the top of the blue marker in order to fade it out a bit. And then I'm going to color this cat blue. And when I do the other character, which will be off screen, I'm going to color that hat in the same red color that I did the stripes on the shirt. So I'm adding a little bit of B14. Basically, I'm drawing around the outside edges of those little sections. And then I'm using the colorless blender to go back in and fade out that color a bit more. And the only thing I haven't colored at this point, now I'm going to finish up, are the shoes. I'm using N3 and N5. So using the N3 on the top and N5 for the sole of the shoe. And I will do a little bit of blending with the N3 marker upwards on each of the shoes. And that completes Mr. Tweedledum. And here's the reveal of the final characters for the cards. Now I'm setting this up on my scan and cut in order to die cut out all the images that have just been colored. I'm not going to show cutting of all of them, but here you will see the general process where I load it into the machine. I choose direct cut. I have it on color recognition mode, and then I'm going to hit the start button so that the machine will scan in the images, and once it's done that, it's going to display what it sees on the screen up to the top right hand side. And so when it comes back through, this part goes much quicker. Then you see the results, and you have little arrows at the top and bottom corners of the screen, so you can drag those in with the little stylus until you have framed exactly what you want the machine to cut out. So once you frame it, you hit OK. It thinks about it for a minute, and then when it comes back, it's going to show you where the cut lines are going to be. And as long as the cut lines are where you expect them to be, then you're good to go on to the next step. So this can take a little bit of time for it to come back and show you a preview. And if I'm happy with the preview, I click OK, and then the button I'm hitting right now and changing is the outline distance. So like a physical die, you can either choose to cut with a little bit of a white edge, or you can have the machine cut right up to the stamp line. I'm choosing to leave basically about a quarter, maybe 1/8 of an inch around each of the characters as they're being cut out. So when it's done, I will have a bit of an edge on each one instead of cutting it right up to the edge of the stamped image. So that's one of the cool options that you have by using the Brother Scan and Cut. And the the stamps don't have any matching dies as far as I'm aware. So the last phase of this series is part 4. So please watch the next video to see how to finish up all these cards.